The desert wind blew across the barren hills of Tunisia in early 1943, carrying with it the smell of dust, oil, and fear. It was here, at a place called the Kasserine Pass, that the young American Army met the German Afrika Korps in battle for the first time. Tanks crawled through narrow valleys, their engines roaring as shells cracked the sky. For the American crews, many of whom had only recently crossed the Atlantic, this was their baptism of fire. But as the German panzers maneuvered with deadly precision, something became terrifyingly clear. The Americans could not talk to one another. Orders lagged, confusion spread, and tanks were destroyed one by one in the chaos. To a soldier crouching inside a Sherman tank, survival often depended on seconds. Yet, without clear communication, seconds turned into hesitation, and hesitation turned into death. The German tanks, though powerful, relied heavily on hand signals, flags, or slow relayed messages. The Americans, on the other hand, carried a weapon invisible to the eye but powerful enough to reshape the battlefield: the radio. At Kasserine, its potential was not yet fully realized, but the seeds of a revolution had been planted. The story of American tank radios begins not in the desert, but years earlier, in laboratories and factories back in the United States. Unlike Europe, where militaries often treated radios as expensive luxuries, the U.S. had developed a culture of mass production. The Army Signal Corps, working with companies like Motorola, had designed compact FM radios that could fit inside every tank, every armored vehicle, and even be carried by infantry. This decision was not glamorous. Radios did not gleam like armor plating or roar like an engine, but they gave something far more vital: the ability for men and machines to act as one mind across miles of battlefield. When America entered the war after Pearl Harbor, these radios were still being standardized. Early sets like the SCR-508 were bulky, their range sometimes limited by terrain, but they offered a reliability no one else had. While the Germans often put only a single radio inside a command tank, the Americans ensured that every Sherman crew could speak not only to each other within the platoon, but also directly to infantry, artillery, and even aircraft overhead. This interconnected web of voices became the nervous system of the American Army. At Kasserine, the system was not yet perfected. Many officers were inexperienced, coordination was poor, and the Germans used their battle-hardened veterans to devastating effect. American tanks were destroyed in the hundreds, their crews often learning too late how vulnerable they were against German 88mm guns. But beneath the smoke of defeat, American commanders began to understand the lesson. They did not simply need better armor or bigger guns. They needed to master communication. The radio gave them an edge, but only if used with discipline and training. In the days following Kasserine, U.S. officers began to drill their men not just in firing and maneuvering, but in speaking clearly, using standard codes, and trusting the unseen voices that linked them together. A tank battle, they realized, was no longer a collection of isolated duels. It was a symphony, and the radio was the conductor's baton. Imagine the difference for a young tank commander. Before, he might crest a hill and stumble upon an enemy formation with no way to warn his comrades until it was too late. Now, with a radio headset pressed to his ears, he could shout a warning across the ether, calling artillery down on German positions or directing fellow tankers into a flanking move. What once required smoke signals or messengers on motorcycles could now be done in seconds, faster than the enemy could react. The Germans had underestimated this. In their earlier campaigns, speed and shock had carried them to victory. Against Poland, France, and even the Soviet Union, their doctrine of blitzkrieg relied on coordination by radio within select units. But they never believed it was necessary to equip every single tank. Radios were expensive, required trained operators, and could break down in the mud or dust. They focused instead on producing the best tanks with the thickest armor and most powerful guns. But at Kasserine, they faced an army that, though inexperienced, had radios humming in almost every vehicle. For the Americans, defeat at Kasserine was bitter, but it was also a turning point. The commanders who survived began to take their radios seriously. They streamlined language, cut down on chatter, and taught crews that discipline on the airwaves could mean life or death. Slowly, a transformation was underway. Meanwhile, back in the United States, factories were pouring out radios in staggering numbers. The American home front was unmatched in its capacity to mass produce. Where Germany struggled with shortages of copper, vacuum tubes, and wiring, the U.S. simply built more. By 1943, tens of thousands of SCR 508 and SCR 610 sets were being installed, not just in tanks, but in half-tracks, jeeps, and command posts. Each radio linked the battlefield together, turning chaos into a kind of controlled storm. At Kasserine, the Americans had been caught unprepared, but their radios were like a sword still in its sheath, waiting to be drawn. In the months to come, as U.S. forces pushed deeper into North Africa, the true power of that invisible weapon would begin to emerge. The desert would become a testing ground, not only for steel and fire, but for the voice carried over static, guiding men through smoke and fear. By the time the campaign ended, the Americans were no longer the same inexperienced force that had been routed in Tunisia. They had learned to talk. They had learned to listen. And soon they would carry this lesson across the sea, where the mountains of Italy and the beaches of Normandy awaited. The American landings in North Africa, known as Operation Torch, marked the beginning of a vast and brutal learning curve. In November 1942, waves of ships unloaded men, tanks, and supplies onto the coasts of Morocco and Algeria. It was the first time that large American forces had fought directly against Axis armies, and every mistake, every misstep, became a lesson written in blood. Among these lessons, none proved more decisive than the importance of radios. The Sherman tanks that rolled ashore were not invincible machines. Their armor was thin compared to the deadly German Panzer IV or the feared Tiger that was beginning to appear in small numbers. Their 75mm guns were adequate but not yet equal to the long-barreled weapons of the Wehrmacht. And yet, hidden inside each Sherman was something the Germans often lacked: a reliable radio, factory-installed, tested, and standardized. As the fighting moved inland, the difference became clear. American tanks, though green and often clumsy in maneuver, could at least speak to one another in real time. In contrast, German formations, especially in Africa, often relied on commanders' vehicles alone to carry radios. A panzer platoon might have a single tank with a transmitter, while the rest carried only receivers, or none at all. Orders had to be relayed with hand signals, flares, or even dispatch riders on motorcycles. Under the burning sun of Tunisia, those delays cost lives. Still, radios alone could not win battles. At first, American units used them poorly. Confusion over call signs and overlapping transmissions clogged the airwaves. Crews panicked, shouting over one another, while officers sometimes struggled to filter useful information from the noise. But with each engagement, discipline improved. Clearer codes were introduced, brevity became essential, and officers realized that the radio was not just a tool for shouting, but a weapon of precision. By the spring of 1943, American units were coordinating artillery fire with a speed that astonished their allies. A Sherman commander under fire could call in coordinates, and within minutes shells would rain down on enemy gun positions. This was something the Germans had difficulty matching. While their artillery was powerful, it often required longer chains of communication, and the fog of war could slow their response. For the Americans, the radio shortened that chain dramatically. The battlefield became more flexible, more alive, and far more dangerous to the enemy. The Germans noticed. Captured reports from the Africa Corps spoke with frustration about how quickly American artillery could react, how infantry and tanks seemed able to adjust mid-battle. One German officer remarked bitterly that fighting the Americans was like fighting an enemy with a single brain, spread across 100 machines. The irony was that the Americans were still learning. The full potential of their radios had not yet been unlocked. As Axis forces retreated across North Africa, the Americans and their British allies closed in from both west and east. The final battles around Tunisia were hard-fought, but by May 1943, the Africa Corps surrendered. For many American tankers, this was their first taste of victory. And with victory came confidence. They carried with them the bitter memories of Kasserine, the sweat and confusion of their first clashes, and the growing realization that technology, if used with discipline, could level the playing field against even the most experienced foes. But the war did not wait. By July 1943, American forces were landing again, this time in Sicily. The rocky hills and narrow roads of the island were a far cry from the wide open spaces of the desert. German and Italian defenders used the terrain to their advantage, ambushing columns and mountain passes and turning villages into fortresses. Here, too, the radio proved its worth. Tank commanders could coordinate with infantry, calling them forward to clear anti-tank guns before Shermans advanced. Engineers, connected by the same networks, could be summoned to clear obstacles or repair bridges under fire. The mountainous terrain tested the limits of early FM radios, whose range was sometimes blocked by ridges and valleys. But even with these flaws, they gave the Americans a crucial edge. A tank isolated by terrain could still cry for help, and reinforcements could be directed with remarkable speed. Slowly, the orchestration of combined arms, infantry, tanks, artillery, and air support became smoother. In September, the Allies crossed into mainland Italy. The fighting there was grueling, slow, and costly. Mud, rain, and German defensive lines turned every advance into agony. Radios were pushed to their limits, often battered by weather and rough handling, but they remained the thread that held units together. German defenders, though skilled, often lacked the same density of communications. For every Tiger or Panther prowling the Italian hills, there were Shermans by the dozen, each one linked into a growing web of voices. By 1944, the Americans were ready for the greatest challenge of all. Across the English Channel, the beaches of Normandy awaited. D-Day would demand a level of coordination unlike anything seen before. Thousands of ships, hundreds of aircraft, and tens of thousands of men would have to move as one. And at the center of it all, once again, was the radio. On June 6th, as the sun rose over the coast of France, Sherman tanks fitted with waterproofing gear rolled onto the beaches behind waves of infantry. The chaos of the landings is legendary. Men drowning in the surf, artillery blasting the sand, smoke shrouding the horizon. Yet within this storm, radios allowed commanders to impose some semblance of order. Landing craft signaled each other. Officers on the beach called for naval fire support, and tank crews linked with infantry pushing inland through the deadly hedgerows. The hedgerows of Normandy posed a new nightmare. Tall, thick, and centuries old, they turned every field into a fortress. German defenders, well dug in, used the cover to ambush advancing Shermans at close range. For a time, casualties were staggering, but once again, the Americans adapted. Crews developed hedgerow-cutting devices welded onto the front of tanks, and with radios, they coordinated breakthroughs. Infantry could signal tanks to punch holes through the hedges, then follow closely behind. What could have been a slaughter turned, slowly but surely, into progress. The Germans fought fiercely, but by now the weight of American communication was becoming unbearable. In Normandy, entire divisions moved like extensions of a single mind. An infantry officer could call for armor support, and minutes later, a platoon of Shermans would arrive. A tank commander could request fighter bombers, and P-47 Thunderbolts would scream overhead to strike German strongpoints. The battlefield was no longer divided into separate elements. Radios had fused it into a single organism, adaptable and deadly. What began as a stumbling first step at Kasserine had grown into a doctrine. The Americans had discovered that in modern war, the most powerful weapon was not always the biggest gun or the thickest armor. It was the ability to talk, to listen, and to act together faster than the enemy. As the fields of Normandy turned red with blood, the invisible web of radio waves carried the Americans forward. And soon, in a breakout known as Operation Cobra, that web would unleash a storm the Germans could not contain. By July 1944, the Americans stood at a crossroads in Normandy. The beaches were secure, but the advance inland was agonizingly slow. Every hedgerow hid German machine guns, every village bristled with anti-tank weapons, and the German Panzer divisions fought with a skill that demanded respect. For weeks the front barely moved, and some feared that the invasion might stall. Yet beneath the mud and blood, a storm was gathering, one powered not by brute force alone, but by voices carried over static, weaving together tanks, infantry, artillery, and air support into a single weapon. Operation Cobra was the turning point. On July 25th, after weeks of grinding battles, the Americans unleashed a massive aerial bombardment to shatter the German defenses near St. Lo. Thousands of bombers thundered overhead, dropping explosives that turned the earth into a sea of fire. When the smoke cleared, the ground offensive began. Sherman tanks rumbled forward, guided by infantry and engineers, while radios crackled with orders and corrections. It was chaos, But it was coordinated chaos, the kind that overwhelmed an enemy already reeling from the shock. German tanks like the Panther and Tiger were technically superior to the Sherman. Their armor was thicker, their guns more lethal, and in a straight duel, a Sherman stood little chance. But duels were no longer the measure of battle. Where a Panther prowled alone, a Sherman platoon could surround it. Where a Tiger tried to hold ground, artillery and airstrikes could be summoned with a few words over the radio. Communication transformed weakness into strength. In the hedgerows, Sherman commanders learned to fight as teams, not individuals. One tank would draw fire, another would maneuver to flank, while infantry guided them from the fields with handsets connected directly to tank radios. This seamless coordination became a nightmare for German crews, who often fought in isolation. Without radios in every vehicle, their movements were slower, their reactions dulled by the need to pass orders by sight or messenger. Against an enemy that could speak instantly across miles, they were at a fatal disadvantage. The breakout from Normandy was a moment of shock, even for the Americans themselves. Once the German lines cracked, the floodgates opened. Sherman tanks surged through the gaps, spearheading deep thrusts into the French countryside. Radios kept the momentum alive. Units that might once have gotten lost in the dust now stayed in contact, adjusting their movements on the fly. When German pockets of resistance formed, artillery was summoned within minutes. When Luftwaffe aircraft appeared overhead, fighter cover could be called. The battlefield moved faster than the Germans could comprehend. The climax of this breakout came at the Falaise Pocket in August 1944, where German forces were encircled and destroyed in staggering numbers. For the Germans, it was a disaster from which their army in the West never fully recovered. For the Americans, it was proof that their doctrine of communication worked. Radios were not simply tools. They were force multipliers, turning quantity into quality, transforming thousands of ordinary Shermans into a war-winning machine. Yet the war was far from over. As the Allies pushed toward Germany, new challenges awaited. In September, at a place called Aricourt in eastern France, American tankers would face one of their fiercest tests. Aricourt was shrouded in mist when German armored divisions launched a surprise counterattack. Panthers and other heavy tanks rolled out of the fog, their guns blazing. On paper, the Germans had the advantage: newer tanks, veteran crews, and the element of surprise. But the Americans had radios, and they used them with ruthless efficiency. As the German formations advanced blindly through the fog, American units guided each other by radio, calling out enemy movements and setting up ambushes. Artillery batteries stood ready to fire on coordinates relayed by forward observers. When visibility cleared, U.S. fighter bombers swooped in, summoned by radio from the ground. In the swirling battle that followed, the Germans lost dozens of tanks, while the Americans, though outgunned, fought as a unified whole. Aricourt became a textbook example of how communication could defeat even a technically superior foe. The battle also revealed a deeper truth. German tank design, for all its brilliance, was shackled by limited communication. Panthers were deadly in one-on-one fights, but war was no longer about duels. It was about networks, about speed, about the ability to act as one organism. Without radios in every tank, German crews often acted alone, unable to adapt quickly when the situation shifted. Against American formations that could pivot, concentrate, or disperse in moments, they were left vulnerable. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union was waging its own armored war on the Eastern Front. There, mass production of the T-34 overwhelmed German forces by sheer numbers. But even the Soviets struggled with communication. Many of their tanks lacked radios, relying instead on signal flags or visual cues. This made Soviet offensives powerful but often blunt, with less flexibility than the Americans enjoyed. In contrast, the U.S. approach combined numbers with coordination, ensuring that every tank was more than just a machine. It was a node in a living network. The psychological impact on soldiers cannot be overstated. For an American tanker, knowing that his voice could reach artillery, infantry, or even aircraft brought confidence. He was never truly alone. For a German crew, isolated in the smoke and noise, the battlefield could feel like a trap. By the time a commander realized he was surrounded, it was often too late. Radios did not just shape tactics, they shaped morale. By late 1944, the U.S. Army had perfected this system. Training emphasized communication discipline, using concise codes and standard procedures to keep the airwaves clear. Factories in America continued to churn out radios by the tens of thousands, ensuring that no tank, no jeep, no squad was left in silence. The result was a military machine that moved not only with strength but with coherence. The next test would come in December 1944 during the Battle of the Bulge. In the snowy forests of the Ardennes, the Germans launched one final desperate offensive. Once again, communication would prove decisive. While the fog and snow limited air support, radios allowed American units to coordinate defenses, rally reserves, and hold key crossroads against overwhelming odds. The battle showed that even in the most desperate conditions, the invisible thread of communication could hold an army together. The war in Europe was entering its final phase. The Rhine River loomed ahead, the last great barrier before the heart of Germany. The Americans had learned their lessons from North Africa, Sicily, Italy, and Normandy. They had seen how radios could turn defeats into victories, how discipline and technology could combine to outmatch even the most fearsome tanks of the Reich. Now, as 1945 dawned, the stage was set for the final push into Germany itself, and once more the voices carried over static would guide the way. Winter settled over Europe in 1944, and with it came the thunder of Germany's last great gamble, the Battle of the Bulge. In the frozen forests of the Ardennes, the Wehrmacht threw its remaining strength against the Allied lines, seeking to split the front and force a negotiated peace. The attack fell hardest on American divisions, many of them unprepared for the storm that broke upon them in December. Panthers and tigers clawed through the snow, infantry swarmed through the woods, and the weather grounded Allied aircraft. It was, in every sense, a nightmare. Yet even here, amid the snow and chaos, the Americans clung to one weapon that refused to fail, the radio. The fog and snow muffled sight, slowed reinforcements, and turned every road into a death trap. But radios gave commanders the ability to respond, to shift reserves, to rally men who otherwise would have been cut off and destroyed. At places like Bastogne, where the 101st Airborne held out against encirclement, radios linked them to higher command, allowing supplies and reinforcements to be organized even as German armor pressed from every side. The Americans suffered, bled, and froze, but they never dissolved into silence. For tank crews, the radio was lifeline and compass. Units caught in the German advance could call back warnings, delaying the enemy and buying precious hours. Field artillery, guided by forward observers with radios, rained shells on German columns struggling to push through the narrow roads. Even when cut off, American tankers used their sets to coordinate last stands, striking from hidden positions before slipping away. The Germans had hoped to sow confusion. Instead, they found themselves slowed by an enemy that, though battered, never lost its ability to communicate. By January 1945, the Bulge was contained. The Americans, together with their allies, pushed the Germans back and regained the initiative. The cost had been heavy, tens of thousands of casualties, entire towns reduced to rubble, but the German gamble had failed. Once the skies cleared, radios again linked the ground to the air, summoning swarms of Allied aircraft that pounded retreating columns. The lesson was unmistakable. Even in the worst conditions, the ability to talk, to share information instantly, was the backbone of survival. As winter thawed, the Allies turned their eyes to the Rhine River, the last natural barrier before the heart of Germany. Here, too, radios would play their part. Crossing a river under fire is one of the most dangerous operations in war, requiring coordination on a scale that borders on the impossible. Engineers must build bridges under artillery fire, infantry must secure the far bank, tanks must cross quickly to exploit the breach, and artillery must shield them all. Without communication, it would be madness. With radios, it became a deadly choreography. In March 1945, fortune handed the Americans an opportunity at the town of Remagen, where the Ludendorff Bridge was captured intact. The Germans had tried to demolish it, but the charges failed. In a moment of desperation, American units stormed the bridge and, against all odds, secured it. Radios crackled furiously as commanders rushed reinforcements to exploit the breach. Sherman tanks clattered across the trembling structure, their radios guiding each movement, while engineers reinforced it under constant fire. The Germans threw everything they had at the bridge: artillery, aircraft, even frogmen swimming with explosives. but it held long enough to pour American forces into the heart of Germany. For the Germans, Remagen was a disaster. For the Americans, it was a triumph of communication and speed. Orders that might once have taken hours to filter through chains of messengers were now transmitted instantly. Units that crossed the Rhine could coordinate with artillery on the western bank, with aircraft overhead, and with reinforcements still moving up. The bridgehead expanded, and with it, the war moved inexorably toward its conclusion. But radios were not only a tactical advantage, they were a strategic one. By 1945, American industry had produced hundreds of thousands of sets, not just for tanks, but for trucks, jeeps, and even small infantry squads. This saturation of communication meant that the U.S. Army could maneuver like no other force in history. Divisions could march separately, yet fight together, converging on the battlefield from different directions, all guided by invisible signals. Logistics, often the silent killer of armies, was kept flowing because trucks could coordinate their movements, avoiding congestion and delivering supplies where they were needed most. The Germans, by contrast, were unraveling. Shortages of fuel, parts, and trained crews crippled their armored forces. Even their vaunted Tigers and Panthers often broke down before reaching the front. Radios, scarce and expensive, could not be issued in sufficient numbers. Many German tanks fought blind, unable to warn allies or receive new orders. Their armored thrusts, once terrifying, became brittle. Against the flexible, well-connected American forces, they were hammered into pieces. The Aracourt lesson repeated itself again and again. When German armor appeared, American tankers did not meet them in duels of steel. Instead, they used radios to summon artillery, to maneuver in groups, to flank and surround. The result was devastating. Panthers and Tigers, symbols of German might, were reduced to smoldering wrecks, not because they were inferior machines, but because they fought in isolation. As the Allies pressed deeper into Germany, communication became the weapon of momentum. The faster the advance, the more vital radios became. Units spread across miles of countryside could still fight as one. Villages fell, bridges were seized, and German resistance crumbled under the relentless pressure. Civilians saw not just an army of men, but an army of voices, moving with a unity that seemed unstoppable. By April 1945, the Third Reich was collapsing. American tanks rolled through shattered cities, their radios guiding them street by street. Infantry called for support with a few words, and Shermans responded. Engineers cleared obstacles as commanders shifted units like chess pieces across the board. The war that had begun with the confusion of Kasserine was ending with a machine of almost mechanical precision. Radios had not only evolved American tactics, they had rewired the very way the Army thought about war. And yet, the end of fighting did not erase the lessons. Tank crews knew what it meant to live by the radio, to trust the unseen voice in their ear more than the armor that encased them. They had learned that silence was death, that hesitation was fatal, and that war in the modern age was not won by strength alone, but by the ability to think and act as one. The Rhine was behind them, Berlin was burning, and victory was at hand. But the true legacy of those radios was only beginning. The world after 1945 would never fight wars the same way again. The Americans had shown that communication could be as powerful as any gun, as decisive as any tank. And in the decades to come, the invisible threads of radio waves would bind not just battlefields, but entire wars. The deeper the war moved into Europe, the more the contrast between armies became visible. And nowhere was it clearer than in the realm of communication. German armored units still relied heavily on outdated systems. Some of their tanks carried only receivers, which meant crews could hear orders but not respond. Others had no radios at all, leaving commanders to shout instructions or use hand signals under fire. For the Soviets, the situation was even worse. Many Red Army tanks had no radios until well into 1943 and 1944, and even when sets were installed, shortages and poor quality meant only platoon or company leaders could communicate. In practice, Soviet tank formations often advanced in near silence, with commanders forced to fire signal flares or wave flags to direct movement. Against poorly equipped enemies, this method sufficed, but in fast-changing, high-intensity engagements against Germans or later against Americans, the delay proved costly. By contrast, American doctrine leaned heavily on the expectation that every armored vehicle had a working two-way radio. This was more than just technology. It was a philosophy of combat. It meant that a junior lieutenant, suddenly facing unexpected German resistance, could immediately call for artillery or air support without waiting for orders to crawl up and down the chain of command. It meant infantrymen pinned down by machine guns could speak directly with a supporting tank platoon and coordinate a strike within minutes. What looked like improvisation was in fact the product of careful planning, mass production, and standardized equipment. American industry produced hundreds of thousands of FM radios during the war, ensuring not only tanks but also half-tracks, jeeps, artillery units, and even reconnaissance patrols were networked into a single communication web. The scale of this achievement cannot be overstated. The United States produced more radios during World War II than all the Axis powers combined, and they did so with enough reliability that units in the field trusted them to work day after day in mud, dust, and snow. The Signal Corps perfected ruggedized sets like the SCR-508, which became standard in armored divisions, and handheld walkie-talkies like the SCR-300, which gave infantry unprecedented connectivity. In effect, the Americans built an invisible nervous system that linked every fighting element together, turning separate battalions into a single organism. Where the Germans were often forced to rely on rehearsed plans that quickly collapsed under battlefield pressure, the Americans could adapt moment by moment. This superiority played out dramatically in battles such as the breakout from Normandy and the subsequent sweep across France. During the rapid advance in August 1944, General Patton's Third Army often outpaced its own supply lines, yet still managed to coordinate attacks across vast distances. Armored columns were kept informed of shifting objectives and enemy dispositions through constant radio chatter. Fuel shortages, not communication breakdowns, became the real limiting factor. German commanders, meanwhile, struggled to regroup after Operation Cobra shattered their defenses. At Falaise, pockets of retreating German forces were bombarded with artillery and airstrikes precisely guided by forward observers who could instantly relay target coordinates. Radios turned the battlefield into a killing ground, where American coordination multiplied the effects of their firepower. Even during setbacks, communication proved decisive. In the Ardennes during the Battle of the Bulge, the Germans attempted to exploit winter fog and surprise to split Allied lines. Many American units were cut off or surrounded, yet their radios kept them connected to higher commands. At Bastogne, surrounded paratroopers of the 101st Airborne maintained contact with Corps headquarters and nearby armored divisions. This enabled reinforcements to be directed to them in time. German spearheads, by contrast, found themselves isolated once fuel ran out and Allied air power returned. Lacking radios across the board, many German tank crews never even received updated orders, leaving them stranded or fighting blind. The Soviets, too, learned painful lessons. In the titanic tank battles on the Eastern Front, such as Kursk, the Red Army compensated for poor communication with sheer mass. Thousands of tanks were hurled forward at once, overwhelming the Germans by weight of numbers. Yet even in victory, Soviet officers noted how many opportunities were lost because units could not coordinate maneuvers on the fly. When Soviet forces began working alongside American-supplied equipment under Lend-Lease, they immediately recognized the difference. American-built Shermans and Studebaker trucks arrived with radios as standard, and Soviet crews often remarked that these alone improved their effectiveness more than the vehicle's armor or guns. In the grand strategy of the war, American communication superiority had ripple effects beyond the battlefield. Commanders at Corps and Army level could issue orders with confidence that they would be understood and relayed instantly. Air-ground coordination evolved into a science, with tactical air forces essentially becoming an extension of armored units. Bombers could be diverted mid-flight to hit suddenly discovered targets, and artillery batteries could mass their fire within minutes on coordinates radioed by a single forward observer. The cumulative result was a tempo of operations that Axis armies simply could not match. Speed of decision-making, speed of response, and speed of concentration of force all flowed from the ability to talk clearly and quickly. This did not mean the American system was flawless. Radios could be jammed, and they sometimes failed under harsh conditions. Interference and miscommunication occurred, and the reliance on constant chatter sometimes betrayed positions to enemy eavesdropping. Yet the advantages far outweighed the risks. Training emphasized radio discipline, code words, and brevity, which limited the damage of interception. Engineers worked tirelessly to keep sets operational. In fact, the American military became so dependent on this invisible lifeline that one of their greatest fears was running out of spare parts or batteries. Still, the sheer scale of production ensured that replacements were almost always available. As 1945 approached, German commanders openly acknowledged that their troops could not keep up with the flexibility of Allied forces. Reports noted how American tanks and infantry operated with fluid precision, adjusting faster than German units could react. Soviet officers, too, after occupying Berlin, wrote about the importance of communication equipment, urging their own industry to prioritize radios in the post-war years. The lesson was unmistakable. In modern mechanized warfare, the ability to coordinate in real time could mean the difference between annihilation and survival. By the time the Allies crossed the Rhine and surged into the heart of Germany, the pattern was unshakable. American units did not always fight better or with more courage, but they fought with greater coherence. Every tank, every squad, every aircraft was part of a single web of command and response. Enemies without such connectivity fought as scattered parts, brave but uncoordinated. The war had proven beyond question that the battlefield of the future would belong not only to those with strong weapons, but to those who could tie them together through the unseen power of communication. By the spring of 1945, the war in Europe had entered its final phase, and the role of communication was more crucial than ever. The Rhine River, the last major natural barrier before the heartland of Germany, stood as a formidable obstacle. Yet when American forces approached the town of Remagen, they found something astonishing: the Ludendorff Bridge still standing. German engineers had attempted to demolish it but failed. Within hours, American infantry and tanks rushed across, using radios to coordinate the perilous crossing under fire. Requests for artillery support, urgent reports about structural damage, and calls for reinforcements all moved across the ether in real time. The bridge had held, and what could have been a bloody delay turned into a decisive breakthrough. Here again, communication meant speed, and speed meant victory. As Allied armies fanned out across the collapsing Reich, the invisible network of radios tied their momentum together. Armored columns thrust deep into enemy territory, often racing far ahead of their maps. Scouts and reconnaissance units constantly reported back, updating commanders who adjusted plans on the fly. Fuel convoys, artillery batteries, engineers, and even medical evacuation units were all kept in motion by a constant stream of wireless messages. In this fluid environment, flexibility was everything, and the American system provided it in abundance. The Germans, deprived of resources, often resorted to bicycles or foot messengers, a jarring contrast to the efficiency of American coordination. The result was a lopsided tempo of operations, with Allied forces moving too fast for German defenses to stabilize. For the soldiers themselves, radios became more than tools of war. They were lifelines. A tank crew under fire could call for smoke cover within minutes. A platoon pinned in a ruined village could summon artillery on the next ridge. Even isolated units gained a sense of connection, knowing that somewhere beyond the static, friendly voices were listening. This psychological dimension mattered deeply. War is as much about morale as about firepower, and American troops felt less abandoned than their enemies. German and Soviet soldiers, cut off in silence, often fought bravely, but with mounting despair. American soldiers, by contrast, could draw courage from the knowledge that help might only be a radio call away. By the time Germany surrendered in May 1945, the lesson was clear. Communication had shaped the battlefield as surely as armor or firepower. It was not glamorous like the roar of artillery or the thunder of tanks, but it bound all those elements into a cohesive whole. Without radios, American forces would have resembled their World War I predecessors, slow, clumsy, and tied to rigid plans. With radios, they became agile, adaptive, and devastatingly effective. The war had demonstrated a new principle of combat: that information, carried instantly and reliably, was as decisive as bullets. The story did not end in 1945. In the years that followed, armies across the world absorbed the lessons of American communication. The Soviet Union, despite winning with mass and sacrifice, poured resources into modernizing its radio industry. Britain restructured its armored doctrine around wireless coordination, and the United States doubled down, making communication technology the foundation of its Cold War military posture. From Korea to Vietnam, and later from the deserts of Iraq to the mountains of Afghanistan, the principle remained constant. The side that talked fastest, clearest, and most reliably would shape the battle. During the Gulf War of 1991, this legacy became unmistakable. American armored columns once again faced enemy tanks, this time Soviet-built models fielded by Iraq. Yet the outcome was swift and one-sided. Iraqi tanks, many without radios or with unreliable sets, fought as isolated groups, unable to adapt once plans collapsed. American M1 Abrams crews, by contrast, were embedded in a seamless network of radios, satellites, and command centers. Orders, intelligence, and targeting data flowed across secure channels in seconds. The pattern from World War II repeated itself. Magnified by technology, the side with superior communication dictated the tempo, and the enemy dissolved under pressure. Looking back, the transformation seems inevitable, yet it was not guaranteed. In the early days of World War II, even American officers underestimated how central radios would become. Some commanders feared too much chatter would create chaos or that dependence on technology would prove fragile. But the battlefield itself gave the verdict. Where communication thrived, so did initiative, coordination, and trust. Where it failed, even the best weapons stumbled. The victories of Patton's armored columns, the defense of Bastogne, the breakout from Normandy, and the crossing at Remagen were not just feats of courage or firepower. They were victories of connection, enabled by voices carried across the air. This legacy reaches even further into the civilian world. The mass production of rugged, reliable radios during the war seeded industries that later built televisions, computers, and eventually the internet. The very idea of a world tied together by instant communication, so familiar now, was tested first on the battlefields of Europe. Soldiers who once clutched microphones in muddy foxholes later returned to build businesses and technologies that connected societies in peace as they once had in war. As we reflect on those final days of 1945, a picture emerges not only of tanks and guns, but of invisible threads linking them all. The American advantage was not invincibility, nor was it superior courage. Every army had brave men. The advantage was coherence. Radios turned thousands of scattered units into a single force, able to strike, maneuver, and respond with unity. It was this coherence that overwhelmed German defenses, that outpaced Soviet rigidity, and that set the tone for modern warfare. In the end, the story of radios in World War II is not a technical footnote but a central chapter in the history of conflict. It shows that wars are not won only by who has the strongest weapons, but by who can bring those weapons together in harmony. The American experiment with universal communication proved its worth on the fields of Europe and echoed into every conflict thereafter. From the hedgerows of Normandy to the sands of Kuwait, one truth remains. In war, silence is death, but connection is power.